Hi, everyone. Great to see you. Thanks for joining for our Climate Justice Design Fellowship Seminar Series, where we have speakers and who are usually mentors in our program. So it's really nice for mentors and fellows to get together and share work, and also share work with a broader community. So today we're delighted to welcome Malcolm Rio, who is a mentor for Dominique Thomas and also a Providence-based graphic designer, architectural designer, and thinker. They're also currently a Ph.D. student in Columbia's University's Department of Architecture, History, and Theory, and do research on the historical intersections of race, sexuality, kinship, and nation building over the past 2 centuries. And it's really a nice mentorship, I feel, as Dominique is also looking at questions of race and Afrofuturist visions for the Harlem neighborhood. So we're delighted to welcome you and to hear a little bit about all of the various work that you're doing. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for being here on Election Day. Happy Election Day. Hopefully everyone goes and votes. Let me, share screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, looks great.
Perfect. Today I'm actually just, I think, going to generally talk about a smattering of work. Hopefully that's okay. I think of all the mentors, I might not be the only one, but I'm one who definitely doesn't directly work with the environment on a day-to-day, especially being a historian who works predominantly around issues of nationhood and race. But what a lot of my conversations with Dominique has kind of filtered around are questions of narrative and questions of representation. And it's been a huge pleasure to work with Dominique. So I thought I might make this presentation somewhat speak to, I think, some of the conversations we've been having. And I'm calling it works in progress only because I do feel like a lot of these projects are kind of continued conversations. Just as a way of beginning, as a historian, I kind of work in between architectural archives and diasporic or Black literature, or that's something that's really coming to fruition in my PhD. And there's a quote by James Baldwin that I think began some of these questions that actually started with a project I did around resiliency in Boston that started to have me really interrogate the role narrative and storytelling play both in architectural practice, but also historical research. And the quote from him goes, "The real terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. And I mean this very seriously. You must accept them and accept them with love, for these innocent people have no other hope. They are in effect still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it." In many ways, it's this quote that has been, I think, in the back of my mind through multiple projects. And so I'm going to start off with a design project that properly focuses on resiliency, go a little bit into teaching, and then some of the historical research I do. One project I wanted to share with you was actually when I was a student of urbanism, not too long ago, but like in 2017, these questions of climate change and resiliency were, of course, already adopted, I think, in many educational practices, but there wasn't necessarily as much of a conversation around environmental racism or racial inequity. And we were charged with redeveloping, this was back when I was a student at MIT, before I became a researcher in the Leventhal Center, redeveloping this stretch of Chelsea along the Mystic River as a way to really begin to understand the role urbanists and urban designers play in this conversation around climate change and resiliency. And right off the bat, the prompt began with economic valuation. We were asked to really think about the amount of money that would be lost due to sea level rise along 20, 30, 50, et cetera years, and develop strategies both in planning, policy, but also architectural and infrastructural ones that would allow for the de-densification of this shore area and redevelop parts of Boston by 2050. Some of the things we were dealing with was the kind of 137 million annualized losses due to physical damage that would then become 455 million and then 1.39 billion. So the studio really had this economic weight at its forefront. But for me, I thought that there was something kind of, for lack of a better word, very paranoid about the studio, and something that also really didn't capture, I think, many of the everyday experiences, both historical, of where we were working, which had long experienced forms of displacement and kind of redevelopment invention. And so I began to really think about, well, what is the role of cultural memory here in this space, rather than just rely on a discourse of policy planning and moving. And in some ways, I was told that I was a climate skeptic just for asking this question. I really wanted to think through, well, what could my project, since it was a collection of projects, contribute to this idea of cultural memory? When I first started off with some mappings of the area, this is based on, I believe, some 2010, because we didn't have the 2020 census yet, but some 2010 data around economic and racial risk that really came off of a Northeastern report on environmental racism and injustice and exposure, to just begin to try to visualize the ways in which, when we're talking about a kind of globalizing threat of climate change, that it has, even within a city, particular effects in different regions. I think there was an article actually in the Boston Globe that similarly talked about, right, this long history of environmental racism. And I felt like in the strategies that we were developing, what was really being lost is that there was a longer history around environmental racism here, that maybe a project that focused more on cultural longevity could play a part of. And I also really thought about the kind of interest that MIT had in both defining Boston as a particular city, one that I was saying is both developed by a kind of American progress narrative, as for those, you're in Harvard, so you know very well the kind of historical trails and the many attractions around the American Revolution, right, the building of democracy, but also how Sitco is not just a kind of emblem, but really refers to a period of Boston's development, or Cambridge's development, which was part of MIT's development, this excess of petrochemicals that really began to found MIT's chemical engineering programs, and many of the ways in which MIT even began to understand its relationship to Boston comes out of this relationship to oil. And I also, maybe foreshadowing going into history, was thinking a lot around how the kind of design prompts we were giving really relied on this narrative of manifest destiny, that the only way to respond to something like climate change was further technological progress, growth, a kind of modern desire to just continue capital in multiple ways, and that there wasn't really a conversation to even question, why are we building in this particular manner, or why was I being called a climate skeptic when I said something like, this feels like a very paranoid brief, a very like militant, even the language we're using of guarding, defending, de-intensifying, rezoning, etc. And so I went completely into the representational. And for me, the essential premise of my project, which I called Monuments of Monsters, was to rethink kind of the ecological crisis as a quote, natural response, in part to the histories of frontierism, continuous innovation and growth that MIT very much continued that rhetoric of, and instilling a morality of consumption, and that there must be a kind of counter response to climate change rather than further development, rather than further growth, and rather than a kind of further faith in technological engineering out of the problems in which engineering in some ways produced. And so for me, representation, or specifically rendering, at its best takes architecture out of the abstract and into the embodied. It asks viewers to construct an imagination not only of space, but of themselves in relationship to that space in a manner that the kind of false neutrality, or the assumed false neutrality of plans and sections cannot. And I hope, like Dominique, who is a Afrofuturist too, has been thinking a lot around like, how do we represent, and what are the ways in which representation can hold an argument. I was also thinking along the lines of how monuments materialize a kind of societal moment, or what often which is often usually related to a benefactor and institution, and what is chosen to remember. And so in many ways, my project was a non-project. It had a lot of, well, not all the professors hated it, but some were very viscerally upset because it decided to allow inundation to happen and kind of use this rhetoric of wetlands and a kind of positive tone that many of the other projects were pursuing, and tried to fold this into the representation. So a lot of these petrochemical tanks became algae ponds that clarified water, that people also played in as a type of cultural park and visited, where the kind of technological augmentation of our modern bodies were reflected back through the quote natural. I also used, I think, a lot of Easter eggs in these representations to kind of bring up this continued reliance or unquestioning of some of the cultural motifs that I felt some of the design briefs were eliding. And it also played on this rhetoric of imminent disaster. So using representation as a way to also speak through the ways we narrativize the climate crisis, which I do want to make clear, right, is something I'm not a skeptic of, but the kind of inability of some students or researchers to even kind of find the prompts and the kind of moral efforts of these prompts to basically suppress questions or any type of critical discourse. And so in many ways, the project was trying to visualize what if we kept a kind of cultural memory that connected across not just Boston, but all the way along the Atlantic coast. Sorry, my dog is having quite a moment. Can you go to your bed? While also in some of these spaces bringing up issues of development and frontierism and kind of faith in technological engineering out of certain problems. And I feel like this has really played a role in my teaching practice. I mean, right now I am a full-time PhD student and a full-time teacher. And so between the two, there is not a lot of time to keep developing, let's say, a personal design practice. But I do want to kind of show the ways in which, even in teaching, I really think of that role of rendering as a way to not just represent, but to ask or pose questions or to kind of fabulate potential futures. And so I've tried my best in many ways to fold this even into, like, this is core one for undergrads, having them start not just with plans and sections, but really think through the collage as a method of making, and how materials and their relationship to light and shadow themselves can try to produce particular questions beyond the technical and a little into the cultural. I think this might really come clear in some of the more advanced studio work that I do here at RISD, and the ways that I try to bridge HTC or history, theory, and criticism with design practice, especially since, I mean, part of my hiring is in line with kind of these buzzwords of social equity, right, and bringing a kind of highlight to them. And so last year I ran a studio called Am I Your Type, which aimed to examine how the profession of architecture had been and continues to be shaped through various attempts of categorization and order of the world, privileging particular worldviews and normative subjects. In the studio, rather than doing away with typologies as inherently problematic, as well as categories and taxonomies, the studio sought to seek ever more accurate or colorful, or what Jack Halberstam has called wild, elaborate, and imaginative and absurd taxonomies, or what Eve K. Sedgwick, a big figure in queer theory, has referred to as nonce taxonomies. Quote, the making and unmaking and remaking and redissolution of 100 of old and new categorical imaginings concerning all of the kinds that may take up in the world. And so in this studio, we really tried to blend a kind of seminar component in art history, critical theory, and queer studies with the act of design making, or trying to find ways in which they could be blended into design. And so as an initial warm-up, students began with kind of ordering their own cabinets of curiosities, starting off with a kind of general premise of collecting 10 things that are similar in a particular way, and then repeating that process 9 more times. And then we're asked to order them one way, reevaluate that ordering, and then order them again and again and again, developing in a way their own grids, and how we might start to think of program and typology as doing similar things. There was then a kind of shift to go into what we called the design research phase. So there was a charrette phase, which was the Cabinet of Curiosities, and then there was a design research phase in which students examined a selection of architectural types that were salient to the economic and political situations in which the profession of architecture was emerging around the 19th century. And working in teams of 3, students compiled a collection of architectural descriptions that combined text drawings and other sources that together codified a typological comparison between spaces that were often treated as programmatically or morphologically distinct. And some of these precedents really stem from a given typology, we would say, like the cafe, while others comprised of nebulous typologies, things that architects tend to not really focus into their oeuvre of work. And so, for example, we compared it really took its cues from some readings we did in critical Black studies, but it compared things like prisons to plantations, slave houses to European coffee houses, and worker towns to slave quarters. And I'll explain some of the thinking behind that. And through this kind of work of excavating or trying to find typological similarities, this design research operated more as a heuristic, you could say, as a kind of understanding of how typology and typological comparison can provide a method for students to introduce spatial histories that would otherwise be ignored or suppressed within the architectural canon. This would be kind of the slave market, slave quarters, and to some extent prisons, although they have been folded into our discipline or narrativized in our discipline in specific ways. The reason half of these typologies had been selected is that while they have often been excluded from architectural histories, the way in which they had operated or some of the findings that we came to found comparisons between one another. In other words, these types represent a kind of dense site for us in which classifications of bodies, natures, and politics and systems were negotiated through and within architectural form. And we can see some of these programmatic analyses here. And so, as I said, as a studio, it was quite interesting because we actually combined seminar. I mean, working with theories, especially of histories of slavery, require a lot of situating and thinking through, as well as kind of thinking through the role categorization plays in the early modern period and how it relates to architecture, and not to take it just as for granted, but also why kind of revisit these histories around slavery and why do it through an architectural studio. And in some extent, we read Simon Gikandhi's Slavery and the Culture of Taste, in which he himself also shows the kind of cultural making within architectural spaces between Europe and the Americas, and calls out both the coffee house and the slave market. And sorry, I just need to move my Zoom. And as the quote goes on screen, you can see, and if one were looking for specific institutions that represented this gathering of creators, distributors, and consumers of culture during this period, it would have to be the ubiquitous coffee house, which in the 18th century replaced the court as a center of high culture. And I think many historians, right, like have called out the coffee house as kind of the site of making of a literary public and a kind of anti-monarchical philosophy. It was in the coffee house that social and cultural life was shaped. Indeed, the coffee house was idolized by Richard Steele, Joseph Addison, and Samuel Johnson as the site of polite conversation, the place in which the improving effect of decorous sociability formed men of taste and morality. In the colonial world of the 18th century America, however, the institution of the coffee house and its sensibilities associated with it were overshadowed by a more powerful presence of a peculiar institution of slavery, which generated a different kind of space of sociability. The man of virtue was more likely not able to be a slaveholder. As such, he was more likely to be found transacting business in slave markets, in taverns, not places of polite conversation. And so in this stage of the studio, we really began to think about historical narrative and its role that it plays within architectural discourse. One of the reasons why we looked at places like the slave market and the coffee house is, although the coffee house is actually not that well studied within our profession, there are a few books that really take it up, and it's kind of weird because many young architects had used the design of coffee houses to establish their own professional practice in many of their day-to-day operations, in the way that they showed wares, and remembering that slaves, and many, as brutal as it was, were a type of ware, had a lot of similarities. And it actually offered our students to think about the capacities of architectural training to not just produce architecture, but to kind of expand representations of this history, which often are suppressed. So here you're seeing actually a postcard of the old slave market in Charleston, which it's now a museum, but for the longest time had been denied as an active slave house. And because it didn't really have a visual archive with it, most of these things exist in bill of sales, right, or slave ledgers, or textual things. There's a deep lacking, we can say, in some of these histories of visual resources or representations that allow certain conversations to take place. And so we really started to think about the role architectural education can play in actually adding to some of this literature and research, in the same way that, I don't know if anyone knows the book Slaves Waiting for Sale, but art historians have begun to think about the role of art history as tapping into this peculiar American history beyond the slave ledger or the slave narrative or the bill of sales, the kind of canonical archival materials that many historians of slavery often relied upon. And then there was a shift. There was a kind of, deep critical shift from this space of research to this space of what we call the design polemic, mostly to kind of also meet some of the institutional needs of keeping a studio design oriented. But here students began to think about the role of what we called a polemic or a design polemic, and how they might use typology as a means of critique. And this ranged from things like critiquing Frank Gehry's prison studios, or what was being called the non-prison prison. Oops. I guess my slides are going without me. Sorry, give me 1 second. And so this ranged from producing projects that themselves were critiques of kind of existing tropes, such as Frank Gehry's prison studios, which some of you may know of, that happened at SciArc and Yale, a kind of drive that in some ways I wanted students to really see there was a serious attempt to design, as contradictory as it is, a more humane prison, but really thinking about these weird linguistic contradictions that sometimes studios find themselves in as like a good prison. Thinking about histories of capitalist extraction and abandonment, such as the Superman Tower here, and the ways in which it frames the kind of the natural and the non-natural, and then questions around gender and domesticity. And so we really used this role of representation and type to kind of make a thesis, you could say a mini thesis or a polemic about the state of architectural education and the state of architectural practice today. And I know that I had a lot of students who were in their penultimate year and are now kind of developing these in their thesis projects. I am properly, though, more of a historian these days. And so similarly, the way that I've kind of even approached architectural history or modern architectural history tends to be through how do we represent, how do we remember, and what do we choose to remember. And I don't want to spend too much time here, but one of the ways we kind of blended, or I've tried to blend, I think, at a school like RISD, which is an art school, creative outlets with deep historical research, is rather than writing term papers, we have really turned to a kind of plethora of outcomes. We've now kind of stuck to the podcast, but many students produced podcasts. And I'll just play a quick sample to kind of show the ways in which we too are trying to really blend this question around history, theory, and narrative Can you hear the?
Recording from Rhode Island School of Design. Here's what we've got for you today. The underlying situation is simple. We are all defined by our historical terms and conditions, and these terms and conditions have mostly been written by and for men. Any woman whose name has survived history has done so against the backdrop of male power. Until very recently,
And that podcast particularly is interested in the role women played in the Bauhaus. We did have these kind of walking tour maps that I wanted to bring up.
1986, in protest against Duke's investment in apartheid South Africa, students built shanties on the lawn in front of Duke Chapel. Another student wrote to the student newspaper, "The shacks, quote, violate our rights as students to a beautiful campus." It just so happened that another student, the great-grandniece of the university's architect, read this and wrote a letter in response. She revealed that her uncle, Julian Abel, working under Horace Trumbauer, was the true author of that, quote, beautiful campus, and that he had been, quote, victim of apartheid in this country as the designer of the campus in the Jim Crow South. She wrote that Duke was, quote, what a Black man can create given the opportunity.
So I know Dominique too is thinking around questions of doing a walking tour, but ultimately it was a question of how do we take something like being at a design and art school and really enliven history? Like many people aren't always the most excited about a historical survey class, but how could we use some of the skills we're learning in studio in the reverse and bring histories more into an embodied experience, whether that be via a podcast or a kind of walking tour in which someone would come around and scan a QR code around Duke's campus and learn about both its building, but this period, this kind of radical period of Duke's history that is not always so present in the building facade. And as a way to kind of conclude, to kind of return to my own work, this has really also dealt with kind of traditional historical narratives. And so, I currently work on a kind of history of Haiti and Black internationalism and the role that some world fairs and bicentennial exhibitions have played in the construction of a kind of a global, quote, modern Black race. And how both world fairs served as a site to play this out through discourse, but also how architecture played a role. But before coming to that space, I actually worked a lot around the history of ballroom, which I think is maybe more mainstream than it was even in 2018. I don't know how many of you know the film Paris is Burning or the show Pose. Towards the kind of end of my education, I had already in urbanism, I had, learned the kind of canonical histories of Paris, of Barcelona, of New York, and its redevelopment in the 1970s. And I wanted to think about the ways in which, oops, I am so sorry, I'm having too much embedded media. The ways in which this kind of well-known history of New York's development could be re-narrativized through a queer and trans perspective, and how ballroom was actually very, very urban, or could be considered quite urban and architectural in its history, not just something for queer history or performance art, and how we might even begin to engage, not to claim that history as our own, but to understand this history of ballroom as a subculture, as a critique of uneven urban development. And so on screen, you see are both Yamasaki projects that kind of that were foreshadowing figures in the structuring of an urban discourse and practice of the environment of reform in the decades to come, where the normalization of the physical environment of modernism, as we see on the left being destroyed, is turned towards the normalization of the psychic environment, especially in postmodernism and its focus on presentation, image, facade, and exterior. The polar realities of these two images in many ways found their equivalence in not just New York City, but also an emerging media landscape at the time. New York City, from its architectures of peep show theaters, sex workers, hotels, crack dens, and queer cruising parks, and graffitied undergrounds, to architectures of fortune such as Trump Towers, Park Avenue, Berghoff Goodman, Indochine, and Wall Street, the city at this time could be described through a list of accepting conjunctions. the myriad urban crises that serve as a backdrop for urban anxieties, in which the politics of image became really paramount. And many historians have talked about like the 80s as a huge concern around image making. And so this project begins to kind of think of the ways in which, New York's transition had a huge image problem, in which postmodernism in a way began to address. But also I really look at some kind of both funny yet deep histories around zoning and landmarking, and how these also similarly were questioned around New York's image. Here on screen, we're looking at some clippings around what was a huge community upset around the presence of a deli on Park Avenue. The stretch between 60th and 90th, I think even today, to some extent, you'll see tends to be mostly residential. And this stems from the mid-century, when there used to be a takeout restaurant, I think in the early 60s, that created a lot of traffic. And so this part of New York actually rezoned 60th and 90th to be predominantly residential. They didn't want a kind of presence of non-residents. And as you know, Park Avenue is very moneyed, right? But they didn't want a presence of kind of people from not the Upper East Side around there. And they also didn't want this congestion. They wanted a more suburban, you could say, experience. And so in the 1980s, a deli appeared, and residents were deeply bothered by this and by the mere appearance of the deli's impropriety, namely the commonality of thriftiness. Residents claimed it jeopardized Park Avenue's property values, its historic character, and its social cohesion. Residents protested that the deli would blanket the street with criminals, literal filth, and rodents, conceivably circumlocutions for other social anxieties that we can kind of project around the 80s and fears of kind of urban crime, that in many ways we are back to that narrative today in this election cycle. And the community swiftly organized lawyers, politicians, architects, engineers, and neighborhood groups to, quote, pore over the zoning, building, and landmarking codes as audaciously as they crawled about the deli's unfinished premises. Charges levied against the deli ranged from its coffee urn violating that specific zoning ordinance that I mentioned, because basically you took away coffee, it was a takeout thing, which prohibited prepared food and carry out services, to the landmark commissioning arguing that the transparent materiality of the deli's door not only ruined the character of Park Avenue, but visibly contaminated the streets with images of produce. As one resident put blankly, quote, "We do not want any food store of any kind. What residents wanted, what was there previously, and what had been previously there was a flower shop." But it's in this contradiction that we realize, though the community very much wanted their flower shop back, the reason why that deli was able to kind of grandfather itself into that region was because the flower shop had actually pled guilty to arranging a set of bombs at a competing flower shop 5 blocks away, as it was actually a front for heroin dealing in the city. The Times poignantly noted that virtually lost in this conversation was, the Times kind of pointed out that what was ironically situated here is that the image of a flower shop really sat with Park Avenue residents, although that very flower shop was part of the problem of crime. And also the deli's owner, Mr. Choi, who was a Korean immigrant, right, also produced this kind of fear over social kind of change in physical geometry linked to social geometry. At the same time, there was a similar zoning and landmarking case on the other side of New York, on the west side, in which residents were deeply bothered by the potential presence of a tower plaza. To kind of summarize this briefly, I don't know if you all know Rice Manor, which still exists with us today, but is actually in a state of dilapidation. It was originally a yeshiva that was economically struggling. And when the yeshiva's dean tried to sell this building to a developer who would build a high rise, the community similarly rose up and used landmarking, which the dean calls landmarking by ambush, used the act of landmarking to try to prevent both the sale and the development of this building. The Times has pointed out that in this massive argument around the architectural worth of Rice Mansion, which had until that point been innocuous and no one really cared, that in this massive turmoil that even brought in people like Jackie Onassis and the Arts Foundations of New York, there was no conversation about really the architectural quality of this. In both cases here, show or demonstrate how a difference, as I said, in physical geometry are linked with the fear of imminent change in social geometry. And they show how landmarking and zoning regulations became a means of policing the city's image in the 1980s. And I go through this mostly because I had to prove to my advisors that ballroom could tap into this conversation by first situating this conversation. But I go through this as a way to kind of foreshadow the ways I'll use ballroom notions of realness, throwing shade, and reading as somewhat parallel to, while again, not trying to adopt or fold that language into architectural discourse, as acts of zoning and landmarking. And then I briefly go over the history of drag and how it developed through the city and how this has a correlation to some of the ways in the 1970s, New York has particular concerns around Harlem, Times Square, and not so much the village, but parts of the village. But that this was a site in which ballroom, drag culture predominantly, but ballroom really grew. For those who don't know of ballroom, though again, it is really having a heyday today, in ballroom, contestants walk categories that emulate archetypal traits of gender, sex, or social classes, and battle through dance forms. The most common known today would be voguing or femme vogue. Many ballroom participants belong to one of a series of kinship formations known as houses, which are led by mothers or fathers who provide wisdom and guidance to other members of the house known as children. In pre-1990 ballroom, both houses and ballroom categories were rapidly evolving to provide an ever more inclusive, safe space for many young, queer, and trans kids and people of color that were disproportionately affected by some of the economic and social packages that New York was putting out in its 1970 to 1980 and the 1990 redevelopment, and experiencing the kind of social hardships in different ways of New York City that in the latter half of the 20th century were then villainized through that kind of mainstream media that I showed over between, let's say, Dallas and Dynasty and CBS's 48 Hours on Crack Street. And so for time, sorry if I'm carrying on, but for time, what the next part of the thesis really does is it looks at the ways in which ballroom is both a kind of response to the social and economic hardships of urban planning and urban packages, but also had a unique read around the way the image of things in the 1980s was really coming to a fruition of how one would move through a city. And this is done, or the way I kind of make this argument is through looking at Jenny Livingston's Paris is Burning and trying to situate it as a proper urban symphony. If you recall the kind of Berlin train film, right? Or in other words, situating as a proper architectural and urban text. In Paris is Burning, the way Livingston actually edited her work is she frames realness through two intertitles, one known as categories, in which realness is introduced as the ability to produce the image of something like executive realness, or to embody essentially a different gender or sex, and how real or convincing that performance may be, but then reintroduces realness under the intertitle realness, in which we learn through figures like Venus Extravaganza, Dorian Corey, and I highly suggest everyone watches this film, Dorian Corey, how realness is actually a kind of strategy of moving through urban space to protect oneself from being beaten on the street or encountering forms of homophobia, transphobia, and to other extents, even racism. And this could be through code switching, or if I'm blanking on the film, but kind of white speaking as well, and how realness became a kind of integral part of New York's urban fabric that then allowed these contestants, I think in many ways, talk about this uneven development in New York and how social stratification produces or is produced in parallel on this use of image and performance and the realness of that image. I also looked at the ways in which Livingston's film has been critiqued highly by many, and in some ways that I think is just, and in some ways that I think is unjust. But I look at the ways in which Livingston's own film is a production of representation, a period of gay assimilation. This was produced at the height of HIV/AIDS, and another scholar who has really worked on the film studies of Paris is Burning has called out that Jenny Livingston had a lot of pressure to develop a film that did not necessarily come off too radical, as in the 1990s and in the wake of HIV and AIDS, there was a huge desire to assimilate rather than, let's say, critique normative societies. And so I look at other films that were produced about New York and queer life at the same time to then kind of give a read of Paris itself as a particular archive, as a particular representation of a particular future, and basically defaults to particular tropes of detritus and a kind of narrative of Black struggle that was not always necessarily the case, while also not necessarily going as far as a film like The Salt Mines or Tongues Untied, which give a kind of, for lack of a better word, more grungy or more real representation of some of the hardships being experienced at New York at that time. And somehow I have now, as PhDs, often produce scholars that come in with an idea and then they come out with something they may have not figured. I similarly looking at the ways in which Haiti, which itself was a symbol, a kind of symbol of Black freedom for many diasporic intellectuals like Frederick Douglass, W.E. Du Bois, etc., how Haiti's participation in these international fairs itself produced an image of Black sovereignty and Black modernity that was made to be distinguished from some of the more anthropological exhibits that world fairs tend to rely on, such as Dahomey Village, and how architecture and its objects became a way to theorize a kind of Black modernity. And by that, I mean a type of racial Black internationalism in which the histories of colonialism and slavery had produced a particular Black subject that was in between, or as Du Bois says, the kind of two consciousnesses of Europe and Africa that was very different than, again, they said, some of these anthropological exhibits that were very overtly racist and colonial as a way to kind of prop up Western nations and their civilizational missions. So in many ways, maybe returning back to that manifest destiny. And here we can see within the Haitian Pavilion some object lessons that art historians have called out, but this making of like the proto-panorama, the idea that from the center of the pavilion, you get this kind of economic landscape for investors, which was the main objective of a lot of these world fairs, was to attract foreign investment and development, see Haiti as a potential market, but also to really take Haiti as a serious nation that couldn't just be taken over. And in the turn of the century, the Monroe Doctrine in the US really comes back to the forefront. And there's a longer history here that I don't necessarily get to detail, but just know that there was, America had tried and then eventually will occupy Haiti in the 1930s, but was trying at this time to just occupy Haiti outright. And Haiti really used its role in these national exhibitions to kind of assert its sovereignty. And some Black diasporic figures use Haiti's assertion of its sovereignty as a means to kind of theorize, right, this modern Blackness. So complex, it blends basically literary studies with architectural history. And the project will end around the 1949-50 bicentennial, in which we see a massive shift around Haiti as an agricultural producer to Haiti as a kind of unique Caribbean destination, and how that architecture too shifts with these economic shifts in a post-US occupation Haiti, right before the reign of Duvalier or Papa Doc. And so I'll end here. So there's a little time to discuss if anyone has any questions, but I'll end with like another Baldwin quote, which is, "I doubt that the village thinks of the devil when they face the cathedral because they've never been identified with the devil, but I must accept the status which myth, if nothing else, gives me in the West before I can hope to change the myth." And I feel like in many ways that's the ambition I go through in the PhD in dealing with a lot of historical histories and trying to kind of rethink them or think through the role of representation and narrative play, but also again, trying to bridge that as much as I can in design teaching and design work. Thank you.
Amazing. Sorry, hold on just a second. It's impressive how much you just went through and how the sort of narratives tied together. So I feel like there's this great narrative arc between the talk and also the work you do. And maybe while others are thinking of questions, can you talk a little bit through the role of different types of media in the current work that you're doing, both in terms of what you're producing, for lack of a better word, but also evaluating?
Yeah, so right at 5, I'm actually going to run to a prospectus meeting where we're going to talk about this. One of the big struggles with the research I'm doing is that a lot of the architecture that is made to represent Haiti as a nation was actually produced by white architects in New York. Many of these world fairs, even the ones that Haiti puts on itself, commissioned architects to really bring to fruition a lot of these works. And a lot of these architectural firms didn't, it's not unusual for an architectural firm to actually not have an archive, but they didn't necessarily archive this work in a way that is as helpful. If you think of the 1980, the 1893 World's Fair, which I started off with, we can talk to ends lengths around, right, like the White City and the Beaux-Arts, because that is like folded into the architectural canon. But when it comes to Haiti, it's really through newspaper clippings, secondary accounts, some pictures. There are some official photos that were made, but it's actually really through writing about the pavilion, through Douglas's speeches on the pavilion, that I have to kind of reconstruct the world of the pavilion and its role in both the World's Fair and this kind of geopolitical history, but also in this diasporic history. So it leads to a lot of skepticism. If I'm answering your question well, Jill, like around how different types of media produce different kind of understandings of the same building. And it risks, or I'm told it might risk a kind of discourse analysis, which has gone out of favor in some ways, but it does have to really rely on description, since we don't have the kind of canonical plan and section. And in fact, I've never seen a plan and section, right, of these buildings to kind of merge the ambitions of an architectural PhD, but also prove, right, that this is a building that had an effect that was set on a world stage. And a lot of it also has to come from art too.
Yeah, I can see the challenge.
Yeah.
But it's exciting, I think, I guess if you're telling histories that are well documented, these aren't the issues, but also we need to broaden those stories. Other questions or comments?
Hi, I have a comment or a question.
Please.
I'm curious. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I was thinking about the podcast as this tool of sort of, also even in your presentation, this sort of the work that goes behind just having to sort of explain terms or sort of set a context or set a scene and just sort of the labor that goes into that, and also the emotional toll that could also come with that, of having to do that in specific spaces or towards a specific audience. And I was thinking about the podcast as maybe almost this solution to that. Not that presentations aren't helpful, but somehow the podcast is something that you can sort of assign or expect someone to sort of listen, and maybe the work is there and the thought is there, and then arrive at your work and be able to, sorry, this is more of a comment, but I'm curious about your experience in having to present the work, and also maybe expectations that you hold in terms of having your audience engage with your work, or yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the comment question, because the podcast is, I'd say it's an experiment. This is the second time we're doing it, but there is something that you bring up around like the kind of just exhaustion of explaining all terms, right? And in a very academic setting, right? Or if I was giving my prospectus talk, there'd be like a kind of term moment, and then the broad net, right? You'd kind of build that out. And in many ways, podcasts do that, but they do that through multiple auditory ends. And so in many ways, what I talk about with my students is like the soundscapes. You know, we were just at some archives today, and we were thinking about, like, you might say we're transitioning to an interview, right, with expert X, but you could also, and you know, the places like NPR do this, talk about walking up the steps into the building where you're meeting someone, the kind of architectural setting in which that interview is taking place, which I think is just as important, right, and impactful to the way we might say this person is an expert, right, because they have this credential. And so we play a lot with like this concept of genre and mood, right? Some are actually going for a heroic tale of a building, right? Narrating a cotton ball in its relation to a mill. And this group is interested in the way mill architecture. Let me just back up a little bit. Like this year we have a seasonal theme too. And so all the podcasts are talking about the making of a Northeastern identity, which I think is really helpful. And this episode is using the character of a cotton ball to kind of narrate, right, through, I think, a diegetic soundscape, right? The cotton ball moving through the mill, being woven, being packaged, being shipped back out, how you could talk about global supply chains, right? And the movement of raw materials into an architectural site, its laboring and out through the diegetic landscape of the cotton ball. And what they'll be doing is they'll be kind of master narrating, right? So they'll be doing, I think it's called I'm honestly, I'm not a film critic, right? I only dabble, but they'll kind of be narrating, if you think of like a Disney movie, on top of that. So there are actually two narratives at play. One that's as if the listener is back in time, being the cotton ball, and then them, the podcaster, is kind of explaining this history. I do think they also get to play with the walking tour they'll do. They meet the cotton ball, not in time, but in space, right? And then they'll start recording these mills and thinking about the way sound really plays a role. But to summarize, like, we have Jess Myers here, who's amazing, who runs the podcast Here There Be Dragons, which was one of the reasons why we started thinking about, as a faculty in many ways, using podcasts. But, you know, she's quite right. She just had an exhibition about sound is like maybe undervalued in many ways as an apparatus of storytelling, and not me like speaking, right? Like, but the way music tells stories, or the way white noise can tell stories, or the way that an echo can talk about scale. In many ways, I think architects have, to some degree, not fully, I think, absorbed the capacities of sound to be very, very effective storytellers and tell multiple stories at the same time. Hopefully, Yasmin, that got to your question.
Yeah, that was great. I appreciate that dialogue.
Yes, sorry.
That's no problem.
And I think with that, we should give you 2 minutes to recuperate between talks. So thank you so much for joining us. And Nathan, did you have a question, by the way? You just came back and forward.
Sorry, my internet was flaking out. If we're stopping at 5, I will hold my question.
All right, we'll follow up with Nathan's question later, but thank you so much, Rio. This has been awesome.
Thank you. Yeah.
And thought-provoking, so we really appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.